right, good morning. Today we are going to finish our study on Ruth with the fourth and final chapter. It seems fitting to do so on Mother's Day, a day that we celebrate moms, grandmothers, and mothers-in-law. Mother-in-laws can get a bad rap sometimes. If you had a good mother-in-law, you're truly blessed. They're the butt of a lot of jokes, but I know I try to be a good mother-in-law, and I had a good mother-in-law. So, from the beginning, as we've talked about Ruth, I've stated that this, they call it the love story. It's not a romance story. Ruth is not a story of romance. It is a love story, but it's not the kind that we're going to tune into the Hallmark Channel to watch. It's about the love that a daughter-in-law had for her mother-in-law, the love and respect that she had for her to the extent that she was willing to leave behind her family, her homeland, and go to a strange land she'd never been before. That tells me a lot about her mother-in-law, Naomi. That she must have been a very loving person, that she was a person who represented God and her faith in all that she did, and that was something that Ruth saw. Ruth said she would go wherever she would go, and that her people would be, your people will be my people, she said, and your God will be my God. She was all in going with Naomi. So they do leave Moab and go back to Bethlehem. And as soon as Ruth goes there, she goes straight to work. She's working in the fields, gleaning. She works hard. She works very long days. We talked about how we know that Boaz was impressed by her work ethic and by her commitment to Naomi, and that respect made him want to do all he could to protect her. He said, "Stay in my field with my women. You'll be protected here." And then Naomi admired and respected Boaz for extending that kindness. She knew he was a close relative and all that came with that. And so she respected him for that. So you've got a lot of love and mutual respect going on here, which are great foundations for any kind of relationship. In chapter 3, I just have a picture just to remind us. We saw Ruth following Naomi's advice. She cleaned herself up, got herself dressed up, went down to the threshing floor where Boaz had been working, and when he went to sleep, she went in and laid at his feet. And he woke up startled when he saw there was a woman laying there. And we talked about how this was not some kind of a seductive act. A lot of people try to read that into it. This was an act of submission, of humility. By laying at his feet, it represented that she was submitting herself to him. Feet represented power, domination, possession. So that was symbolic of that. And then when he realizes who she is, Ruth asks Boaz, she says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me." And what that signified was that he would cover her with his protection, his authority, and it meant marriage. So basically, she was asking Boaz to marry her as the kinsman redeemer of the family. And Boaz was deeply honored, and he lets her know, how honored he was. But he's like, there is a relative who is closer. Remember we talked about he was a rule follower. So he's following the rules. And so he says, and if he wants to do it, if he wants to step up and be the redeemer and marry you and do all this, good, let it be so. But if not, then I will do that. Now, that doesn't sound like any romance movie that I ever saw. It was always, we'll find some way to overcome this hurdle, this difficulty. No, he wasn't trying to circumvent the process. He was saying, we're going to do this the right way. So that, to me, was more evidence that it wasn't a love story. And he sends her home to Naomi. And, of course, he doesn't send her home empty-handed. He gives her a whole lot of grain to take with her, again, that provision, and to tell no one that she was there. Not so much because of, I guess, any embarrassment, but he has a plan, and he doesn't want it known that she's made known that she wants to be redeemed, that she wants the kinsman redeemer to act and to redeem her. He wants what's best for her and Naomi. And like I said, if the other man won't step up, then he will. So that's where we left off. So now we're going to get into chapter 4. We'll start with verses 1 and 2. Boaz went to the town gate and took a seat there. Just then the family redeemer he had mentioned came by. So Boaz called out to him, "Come over here and sit down, friend. I want to talk to you." So they sat down together. Then Boaz called 10 leaders from the town and asked them to sit as witnesses. So the town gate was the center of activity in Bethlehem. It's where people had to pass coming into town and going out of town. Everybody had to go through that way. Merchants were set up in that area. It was a place to do business. The leaders met there. It was kind of like a city hall where legal matters were brought up and dealt with. A very, very public place. Boaz wanted to do everything out in the open. Today, that is also something that people want. You hear the word a lot on the news, transparency. People want to know what's going on. They don't want to have any of these backroom deals and the good old boys club and all of that stuff. They don't want things swept under the rug. They want everything out in the open so that everybody can see and know what's going on. And so this is what Boaz wanted. He came to the most public place in town to do this business. He didn't go to this man's house to strike a bargain with him. Instead, he brings it to the most public place in town and then invites 10 leaders to come and sit in on their conversation. And I had to think about this poor guy just coming into town, probably for some groceries that his wife sent him for. And here's Boaz. "Oh, come over here, buddy. I need to talk to you." And then he's got 10 guys with him, and you're thinking, uh-oh, what did I do? So I'm sure he had to be a little apprehensive. Okay, verses 3 and 4. And Boaz said to the family redeemer, "You know Naomi, who came back from Moab. She is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should speak to you about it so that you can redeem it if you wish. If you want the land, then buy it here in the presence of these witnesses. But if you don't want it, let me know right away, because I am next in line to redeem it after you." The man replied, "All right, I'll redeem it." So this is the first we've heard about property for sale, right? Why is he talking to this guy about land for sale? I thought this was about he's gonna marry Ruth. It's about that, right? What's going on here? Sometimes God does things in ways that we don't expect, right? And I think about if, there's some of these commentaries you'll read that will say like, "Oh, Ruth and Naomi had to be on the sidelines just biting their nails, when he said, 'All right, I'll redeem it.' They had to just be wringing their hands." And I'm thinking, I don't think they were even there. This was man territory, okay? Possibly, I don't know. They could have been in a corner somewhere. But you know that Naomi would have to say, "Boaz, what are you talking about? This is about Ruth." Ladies, sometimes we can't help ourselves. We have to say, "Nudge, nudge, that's not what we're here for." So, it's kind of like when Jesus was telling his disciples about what was going to happen, how he was going to go to Jerusalem, he was going to be crucified. And Peter's like, "What? That wasn't part of the plan. Never. No, that's not it." We don't realize that God has a plan. So here's the deal that this guy didn't know, is that the land and Ruth were a package deal. Now, that other shoe hasn't fallen yet, so to speak. So he hasn't found that out. Boaz knows that if he ends up being the redeemer and he marries Ruth, he also has to buy the land from Naomi. But the other man didn't realize that. The property comes with a wife. The kinsman redeemer is given that first opportunity to buy the land, to keep it within the family, within their tribe. Think back to when they went into the promised land, how the land was divided up by tribe. And the intention, all the laws around that and everything, the intention was to always keep that in those families. It was meant to be kept that way. They weren't supposed to sell the land, but they could sell it, lease it as a tenant position. possession. It could be sold for a period of time, but it had to return to the owner in the year of Jubilee or be purchased by a kinsman redeemer. There was always a way for it to come back to the family. So when Boaz tells him about this land he can buy from this aging widow, Naomi, well, Naomi, I don't have to worry about, marrying her or anything. I'm going to be buying it from her. He says, well, yeah, of course I'll buy it. I mean, who's not going to turn down a chance, to get some more property, right? Here's what happens in 5-8. Then Boaz told him, of course, your purchase of the land from Naomi also requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite widow. That way she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family. Then I can't redeem it, the family redeemer replied, because this might endanger my own estate. You redeem the land. I could not do it. Now, in those days, it was the custom in Israel for anyone transferring a right of purchase to remove his sandal and hand it to the other party. This publicly validated the transaction. So the other family redeemer drew off his sandal and said to Boaz, you buy the land. So by exercising his right as a kinsman redeemer, the man would have to fulfill all the duties, which included marrying the widow, which would have been Ruth, and having children with her to carry on that family name of Elimelech, which his son Mahlon was her husband, who would have been Elimelech's heir. So upon hearing about Ruth, the man does a complete turnaround. Oh, no, then I can't redeem, because it might endanger my own estate. So in other words, he probably already had a wife and sons that he had already divided this estate, and bringing in another heir would just split it down into smaller parts. And he probably had a wife that would not be real happy about that, and sons. And him saying no to fulfilling these duties as the kinsman redeemer, that was really kind of a big deal. It was a big deal. It wasn't like, oh, here's a deal, take a look at it and see if it's something you're interested in. If not, if you want to pass, it'll go to the next person. We do that all the time with things, right? In our free marketplace, something we don't like, it's not a deal we want, we just move on. But this was a big deal. It was a serious matter about family and honor and obligation. Legally, yes, he had the right to refuse, but culturally, it was extremely frowned upon, because he is not stepping up to do what he is supposed to do in that role. And to understand this, we have to go back and look at what the law says. And it's in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5-10. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of the brother-in-law to me. The elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, the brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. So it was a big deal to refuse. And I'm sure when they wrote this law, there were men that had their reasons. And if getting spit in the face and being called that was worse than marrying, or was better than marrying this woman, then I don't know. I guess that's something you have to, between you and God. But it was considered disgraceful and a shameful thing to refuse to step up and to provide for your family in need. And I think this is a reminder to us not to count on man to provide for us, to save us. Even the most philanthropic giving people have their limits. At some point, they will choose their own provision over someone else's. At some point, there's that line. We're willing to give some, we're willing to even give a lot, but maybe not give all. But Christ, our Redeemer, was willing to give all. He gave all. And in this account, we see Boaz is representing that true Redeemer. So the man removes his sandal. Remember what it said about feet and how they symbolize power and possession. So I think that's why that sandal comes into play. But by removing his sandal, he forfeited his claim to the property. It was symbolic. There was no need for Ruth to call the elders in and have them talk to him and to spit in his face. They kind of, at this point, they've got past that point and just gone straight to the symbolic transaction of what it all means. But it released his claim on the property, and it was in front of all these witnesses. That's what was symbolized by the removal of the sandal. So we don't know after that if people did look down on him or how he might have been treated. But several commentators point out it was interesting that he's not given a name in this account. We never know what his name is. So I thought that was a valid point. Verses 9 through 10. Then Boaz said to the elders and to the crowd standing around, "You are witnesses that today I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. And with that land I have acquired Ruth, the Moabite widow of Mahlon, to be my wife. This way she can have a son to carry on the family name of her dead husband and to inherit the family property here in his hometown. You are all witnesses today." Now, Mr. Unsandaled, as I'm now going to call him, has publicly said he will not exercise his rights as the kinsman redeemer. And then Boaz publicly states that he will. He states that as of this moment, with this transaction, he has purchased Naomi's land and he has acquired Ruth as his wife. The Hebrew word that's used here is kanitha, and it's a word used in legal and commercial context in describing obtaining property or possessions through a formal transaction. So the marriage is part of this legal transaction that has just now taken place at the city gate. It is legal and binding, witnessed by the elders, to ensure that the dead man's name would not be forgotten. That is the whole purpose behind this. We're like, go Ruth, get you a husband, but that's not what the story's about. It's all along, it's been about preserving the name of Elimelech in Israel. It's about honoring them. It's about doing right by them. Boaz is gaining this property, but eventually it's going to be transferred to Mahlon's heir. The son that he has with Ruth is technically Mahlon's heir. So that child's going to inherit the property. So Boaz may be the owner for a time, but it's going to go right back to Elimelech's line, to his heritage. So Ruth probably didn't get a big church wedding. I know in a lot of movies about this, you see them having a little marriage ceremony with Boaz and Ruth. I've seen a lot of pictures when I've searched for images on this. So, they probably didn't have the big church wedding, so to speak, or even the Justice of the Peace Courthouse wedding. It was because of this transaction of the law that the marital status transferred from Mahlon to Boaz, because he steps in as the substitute, the kinsman redeemer. Verses 11 through 12. Then the elders and all the people standing in the gate replied, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, from whom all the nation of Israel descended. May you prosper in," I wrote down how to say this, Ephrathah, and be famous in Bethlehem. And may the Lord give you descendants by this young woman who will be like the house of our ancestor Perez, the son of Tamar and Judah. So like I said, this wasn't happening in a closed-off courtroom or, in an alley somewhere. This was at the public gate. So there were people coming and going. So I'm sure that people stopped to listen. and to see what was going on. That was probably where all the town news happened. And so all the people standing by, as soon as, that this has transpired, this is pretty exciting stuff. And, there was no way that Mr. Unsandaled could ever deny that he had given up his rights, because he had done this very publicly. There were lots of witnesses. And the crowd acknowledges Boaz's noble act in being the kinsman redeemer, following the rejection by the first one. And so they gave him this blessing. It says, may the woman be like Leah and Rachel. Okay, so those were the mothers of Israel. Yes, some of their servant girls were the children of some of it, but technically they fall under Leah and Rachel. So in other words, they're saying, be fruitful, have many, many children. They produced the 12 tribes of Israel. To prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Well, Ephrathah means fruitful, and it is actually the ancient name for Bethlehem, but it kind of described like not just the city, but that whole region, that whole area. And certainly, famous in Bethlehem. Of course, they had no idea how famous Boaz actually would become, but I'm sure that they talked about this for many years in Bethlehem. I'm sure as they watched this couple marry, have a child. Oh, look, there's that beautiful baby. I was there that day at the gate when Boaz redeemed her. Do you remember that? They probably talked about that for a long time. And then it said to have descendants like our ancestor Perez, the son of Tamar and Judah. Remember, we talked about them. This is a study about the women in the lineage of Christ. And that was the first person we talked about, was Tamar, and about these twins that she had. And Perez was the one that, he was not the first one to come out. The first one stuck his arm out. The midwife put a scarlet thread on his arm. He pulled his arm back in, and Perez said, out of my way, brother, I'm coming out. And he was called the breech maker because of that. That's what the midwife called him, breaking out. And sometimes it appears as Pharez rather than Perez. So they said, our ancestor Perez. So the people in Bethlehem were ancestors coming down from the line of Perez in the lineage. And of course, the lineage is really important in this story. That's what it's all about too. In Numbers 26:20, it says, the descendants of Judah by their clans were through Shelah, the Shelonite clan, through Perez, the Perezite clan, and through Zerah, the Zerahite clan. So from the Perizzite clan on down, those were the people who were in the area of Bethlehem. Shelah was the son that Judah would not give to Tamar. If you remember, that's why she had to do what she did, because she'd already gone through 2 of his sons that had died because God was not pleased with them. And Judah was afraid to give her the youngest one. And so that's when she had to deceive him, and he became the kinsman redeemer for the family. So that is their ancestor, Perez. So that's why it says to be like them. Ruth 4:13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. When he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women of the town said to Naomi, praise the Lord who has provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age, for he is the son of your daughter-in-law who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons. Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast. She cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor women said, now at last Naomi has a son again, and they named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. So like I said, there was no wedding ceremony probably. He acquired her. It says he took her into his home, and she became his wife. So, the marriage was consummated. That made she became his wife. And then it says that the Lord enabled her to conceive. In others, it says the Lord gave her conception in other translations. So why is that significant? If we think about what we know about Ruth and Boaz, that the Lord enabled her to have a baby. Any thoughts? Okay, so we believe that he was considerably older than she was. She had no other children. She had been married possibly as long as 10 years to Mahlon and had not had any children with him. That may have been God's hand in that. But whatever the reason, at this point, neither of them, and Boaz didn't have any other children that we know of. It doesn't say that he ever had a wife or had children, because that certainly would have come into play in terms of property and rights and things. So, so God made it possible now for the two of them, despite what other couples in these similar situations would face these same kind of issues. But this was the Lord's will. He is building his lineage to Christ. I mean, he's not going to leave that to some haphazard kind of thing. God always has things planned and in order. And, the people had prayed this blessing over them. They prayed for them that they would be fruitful. So this is God fulfilling those prayers. Those prayers were right in line with his will. God was in control through all of it. And the birth of their son was not only a blessing for them, but it was a blessing for Naomi. She's important in this story too. She was the one that, had lost her husband, lost her sons. She was in a foreign land. She felt forgotten. She even called herself bitter and wanted to change her name to Mara. Though she was the only person that ever called herself that. We don't see that name again. And, she did, sometimes when you reach that point, the best thing you can do is go back to the beginning. And she wanted to go home. She just wanted to go home to Bethlehem. And then, here's Ruth, this wonderful daughter-in-law, who said that she was better to her than 7 sons, that wanted to come with her and to be with her. And the women recognized this too, how wonderful Ruth was as a daughter-in-law. And that, God had provided a redeemer. In like the other translations, it says, God has not left you without a redeemer. God has not left us without a redeemer. Sometimes we go through difficult times. Sometimes life does make us a little bitter. But God has not left us without a redeemer. And it sounds like that Ruth and Naomi continued to be very close. She probably was right there in their household. It says that she helped care for him like it was her own son, this grandson of hers. They named him Obed, and his name means servant. What an appropriate name for the ancestor of our Savior, who came to serve and not be served. And we know that this book of Ruth had to have been written after David, because he's mentioned here. So, because, if they're writing it, they don't know ahead of time who's going to be it. So we can kind of figure out that's when it was written. Some speculate Samuel is a possible author, but nobody really knows for sure. But it certainly was after that time. And then the last verses, 18 through 22. It says, this is the genealogical record of their ancestor Perez. So going back to where they identified as that they are from the lineage of coming down from Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. So this, like I said, further demonstrates that the people in Bethlehem said that they came from the line of Perez, as listed in Matthew 1. And so it's the same as Matthew 1, except for a couple things. Do you see something in this? Do you see something that's missing in this one that was in Matthew's genealogy? Or something that's been added? Either one. The women are missing in this one, right? We see in Matthew 1, we see that was the mother of Ruth. We see Rahab's name in there. So big change when we get to Matthew 1 in how this genealogy is listed, because Matthew includes this woman. And also in Matthew's, he refers to him as King David. So in the first one, it just says David. So perhaps David was not yet king when this one was written. So those are kind of like some little clues that we can look at, and I'm sure that that's what historians do when they're trying to determine when these things were written. So that wraps our love story of Ruth, a woman who loved and served her family and God. It's a story of redemption. We have a Redeemer who will step up and provide for us. We have a Redeemer who provides us with salvation, protection, provision that we can count on. And he will never pass on us. He will never look at the deal and say, this might mess things up. This might mess up my estate. I'm going to pass on this one. He's never going to do that to us. Okay? He's always going to redeem us. He will take us into his home. He acquires us. And he acquired us with the blood that he shed at the cross. He paid a great price to acquire us. So you have to ask yourself, have I been acquired? Because if not, you want to be acquired. Because he paid a great price for each and every one of us. Amen? Amen? That's it.